not at a wall, but at the inside of his own skull. The sound is faint, but once you hear it, it never leaves you. In February of 1851, a man stumbled barefoot through the frost-bitten fields of Henrico County, Virginia, his skin so pale it reflected the moonlight, his arms slick with blood, not his own, and his eyes. Those eyes held no recognition. They belonged to Timothy Henderson, one of the infamous Henderson twins. Within weeks, he would be dead. But his death was not the beginning. It was the result of something done to him. Something no doctor in America will admit happened. You are about to hear the version no one was meant to hear. It is not in the archives. It is not in the polite histories of Richmond. It comes from letters burned before they could be filed, from testimonies whispered on deathbeds, from records altered with surgical precision. Once you know it, you will understand why the medical community sealed its mouth shut for over 170 years, and why even now, in the age of open information, certain truths remain as forbidden as they were in 1851. The Henderson family was no stranger to moral decay. Their plantation wealth was built on tobacco, but sustained by another trade, one so grotesque it makes the blood turn cold. Jeremiah Henderson, the twins' father, supplied the Medical College of Virginia with what they called anatomical specimens. At first, only the bodies of those who died naturally on the plantation. But soon, death began to visit more conveniently. And always when the college's need for material grew urgent, Thomas and Timothy grew up knowing this trade like other boys knew farming or carpentry. They saw their father not just kill, but prepare death, clean it, measure it, sell it. And when Dr. Cornelius Hartwell arrived in Richmond with theories about a mind as a machine, he saw in the Henderson twins not just two wealthy young men, but an opportunity, an experiment, a perfect one. The events that followed would be erased, rewritten, or locked behind coded notes no one could decode. But fragments remain, and if you follow me down this path, I will show you the pieces they could not destroy, and you will see why science itself turned away in terror. To understand the end, you have to step back into the Henderson world before the winter of 1851, a place where wealth masked rot, and the rot was not hidden, only ignored by those who profited from it. The Henderson plantation was 800 acres of Virginia soil so rich they said you could plant a stick and watch it grow into a tree. It stretched from the red clay hills to the curve of the James River, a brown serpent winding through the countryside. From a distance it looked like prosperity. The 3-story brick mansion with white columns, the tobacco barns standing like sentinels. But prosperity here was fed by something other than the land. Jeremiah Henderson had built his fortune on more than tobacco. His real profit came from selling what no man should sell. The bodies of the dead. The Medical College of Virginia paid well for anatomical specimens. At first, only those who died of age or disease among the enslaved. Then, bodies began to appear at more opportune times, when the college had a sudden need, when a doctor's class was short of material, when the right buyer whispered the right price. The dead were prepared with skill. Jeremiah had learned preservation from a disgraced physician who had fled Charleston for grave robbing. He could keep a body intact long enough for study, long enough to make it worth far more than a burial would cost. Runaway notices were posted for those who had simply vanished, documents forged to show they had been sold to distant plantations. In truth, they had been crated and delivered to Richmond under the cover of night. Thomas and Timothy saw it all. By 12, they were watching their father decide who would vanish next. By 15, they were helping prepare the bodies themselves. By 20, they were doing the choosing. And then, in the spring of 1850, a man arrived who would change everything. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, tall and thin, with E. Yes, that examined not just faces but thoughts. He spoke of the human mind as a machine, of changing behavior like turning a gear, of curing the criminal or the mad with precise adjustments, and when he learned the Henderson twins were identical in every measurable way, he began to imagine the perfect test. 2 minds, 2 bodies, one experiment that could prove him right or destroy them both. Hartwell's approach was never direct. He did not stride onto the plantation with demands or promises. He came as a guest, a man of learning, curious about the famed Henderson estate. At dinners he spoke of science in a way that felt less like conversation and more like seduction. He painted the mind not as a mystery but as a mechanism, a clock that could be taken apart, cleaned, and put back together to run in perfect harmony. Thomas listened with a hunger in his eyes. Timothy listened with stillness. But stillness does not mean disinterest. Both men had grown up in a house where human life was reduced to flesh and function. Hartwell's theories simply gave their upbringing a new language, one that made cruelty sound like progress. Weeks passed, and the visits grew more frequent. Hartwell began to ask questions no polite guest would ask. How do you feel when you strike a man? How long can you stare into another's eyes before they look away? Do you ever dream the same dream twice? He never wrote down their answers in plain words, only symbols in a leather-bound book no one else was allowed to touch. One night, under the pretense of showing them an anatomical specimen from Philadelphia, Hartwell brought them into his private rooms at the medical college. There were jars filled with pale shapes that once had names, tables with straps that shone in the lamplight. In the center, a chair built not for comfort but for stillness, with brass fittings to hold the head perfectly in place. It was there he told them his vision. 2 identical men, one exposed to a precise sequence of chemical treatments and sensory conditions, the other shielded, kept as the pure control. Every difference that emerged would be proof, undeniable, that the mind could be engineered like any other device. Thomas was intrigued. Timothy remained unreadable. Hartwell assured them this was not cruelty. This was contribution, the key course. Of work that would place their names alongside the great men of science. But beneath his smooth words was something colder, a hunger not for discovery, but for domination over the last part of man still beyond the reach of chains. They did not yet know that agreeing would seal their fate. But in Hartwell's mind, the experiment had already begun. The first stage began so quietly the twins did not recognize it as a beginning. Hartwell insisted on separate consultations. Claiming it was necessary to maintain the integrity of his study, Thomas would meet him in a chamber lit only by a single oil lamp. Its light focused on his face, while the rest of the room dissolved into shadow. Timothy met in another room across the hall, bright with morning sun streaming through tall windows, light and dark, heat and cool. Hartwell believed every element of the environment could shape the mind like clay in a skilled hand. For Thomas, the treatments came in the form of liquid, bitter tonics in small glass vials. Each handed to him without explanation, the burn down his throat was sharp. And within minutes his pulse quickened, his skin flushed hot. The questions followed, not idle chatter, but pointed provocations. Hartwell would speak of betrayal, of enemies hidden among allies, until Thomas's jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists. Hartwell would record the reaction in his coded notes, the angle of Thomas's head, the dilation of his pupils, the tremor in his breath. For Timothy, the approach was reversed. Hartwell gave him nothing to drink, only stillness. He would ask no questions. He would only sit, watching, until the silence stretched long enough for Timothy to fill it with his own thoughts. Some silences lasted hours. When Timothy finally spoke, his words came slow, and each one was written into that same coded ledger. Neither twin suspected that Hartwell was also working on them in their absence. At night he would visit the plantation under pretext of delivering medical advice to Jeremiah Henderson. But in truth he was entering their rooms. For Thomas, he replaced the oil in his lamp with one that gave off fumes just shy of detectable. enough to quicken the heart in sleep. For Timothy, he shifted his bedding to subtly cool his body through, or the night, slowing his metabolism and dulling his hunger. Over weeks, differences began to appear. Thomas moved with restless energy, speaking faster, sleeping less. His eyes sharper but edged with something fevered. Timothy grew quieter, slower. His body leaner to the point of frailty. His gaze fixed longer on things unseen. The twins thought they were enduring the cost of knowledge. In truth, they were being divided, two halves of the same life, pushed toward fates that could never meet again. It began with small things, at a gathering in Richmond. Thomas interrupted a state delegate mid-sentence and laughed loud enough to turn every head in the room. Timothy stood at the edge of the crowd, not speaking, not even seeming to listen, his eyes fixed on a corner where no one stood. By spring, the changes could no longer be disguised as temperament. Thomas moved like a man always late for something. His stride sharp, his voice too loud in quiet spaces. He spoke of plans that made little sense, ventures no one could trace, enemies no one else could see. Timothy spoke less and less, sometimes answering questions with only a nod or a blink. Once, Jeremiah found him sitting at the foot of his bed in the dark, hours after the household had gone to sleep, when asked what he was doing. Timothy said only, waiting for the signal. The city began to talk. Servants carried stories to market stalls. Students at the medical college whispered about Hartwell's late-night meetings with the Henderson twins. Some claimed to have seen Thomas in the college's east wing at midnight, pacing the hallway with eyes wide and unblinking. Others swore Timothy had been spotted in the dissection hall, standing perfectly still as Hartwell worked. His gaze fixed on the cadaver as if listening for something inside it. Hartwell denied nothing. He simply reminded those who questioned him that progress often looks like madness to the uneducated. Privately, his notes became darker. He recorded the moments Thomas erupted into rage without provocation, the hours Timothy could sit without moving a muscle, and the way both brothers' dreams began to follow a pattern he had designed months earlier in the Henderson household. Jeremiah grew uneasy. The twins were valuable to him as heirs, and more valuable still as willing participants in his hidden trade. But Hartwell's influence was pulling them away from his control, the Sauson-Seond. Old Man began to suspect that he had allowed a rival into his home, one who dealt not in bodies, but in minds. The suspicion came too late. By the time Jeremiah considered ending Hartwell's involvement, the damage was already spreading. The twins were no longer brothers in any true sense. They were two experiments running side by side, and Hartwell, like a clockmaker listening to the ticking of his own creation, was waiting for the moment one of them stopped. The break came in June. The air was thick with heat and the smell of cut tobacco. Thomas had been pacing the veranda since sunrise, muttering under his breath, fingers twitching as if plucking invisible threads. Timothy sat beneath a pecan tree, still as the trunk behind him, his gaze locked on nothing anyone else could see. Jeremiah had summoned them both to discuss a shipment bound for Richmond, a simple matter of timing and payment. But when Thomas entered the study, he stopped halfway to the desk. Staring at his father as if he were a stranger, he said the shipment should be delayed. Jeremiah asked why. Thomas leaned in close and whispered, "Because he's watching." Jeremiah asked who. Thomas's answer was so soft it was almost swallowed by the room, the one in the walls, before Jeremiah could respond. Timothy stepped into the doorway. He spoke in a tone none of them had heard before. Deep, deliberate, certain. The shipment leaves tonight. Then, turning to Thomas, "And you will not be on it." Something passed between the brothers in that moment. Not words, not gestures, but a silent exchange that tightened the air like a rope drawn taut. Thomas lunged first. Jeremiah barely had time to move before the desk tipped and papers scattered. Timothy did not strike back with fists, only wrapped his hands around Thomas's wrists and held them still, with a strength that did not match his frail frame. Thomas struggled, snarled, cursed words Jeremiah had never heard from his son's mouth, and Timothy, calm, expressionless, whispered over and over, "It's not for you. It's not for you. It's not for you." When Jeremiah finally tore them apart, Thomas's face was flushed, his breath ragged. Timothy's pulse was steady. Hartwell arrived minutes later, claiming coincidence, saying he had been in the area visiting a patient. He examined Thomas briefly, declared it nothing more than exhaustion. But Jeremiah saw the glint eye. In his eyes, not concern, recognition. That night, the shipment left for Richmond. Timothy rode with it. Thomas did not sleep. And Hartwell, in his private journal, wrote a single line beneath the date, "Separation complete." The wagon reached Richmond under cover of darkness. The driver never asked why one of the Henderson sons rode in the back among the crates. Timothy never spoke on the journey, only kept his hands resting on the lid of the largest box, as though guarding it from something unseen. At the medical college, Hartwell was waiting. No greetings, no questions about the road. Just a nod toward the east wing, the one locked to all but a handful of staff. There, the smell of preservative chemicals hung heavy in the air. The floorboards creaked under the weight of tanks filled with pale forms, suspended in amber liquid, each one labeled not with a name, but with a number. Hartwell led Timothy to a room he called the chamber. It was smaller than Timothy expected, and colder. Metal fittings lined the walls, each connected to wires that vanished into a panel of dials and switches. In the center stood the same chair Timothy had seen months before, the one built to hold the head perfectly still. But now there were additions: leather straps for the arms, weighted cuffs for the ankles, a device of polished brass that curved like an insect's limb toward the space just above the eyes. Hartwell spoke in his usual calm tone. "Here, we can do work the plantation would never allow. We can finish what we began." Timothy sat without protest. The straps closed around him. Hartwell adjusted the brass device until its tip hovered a hair's breadth from Timothy's forehead. A low hum filled the room, followed by a warmth that seeped into the bone. Hartwell told him to focus on a point on the far wall. Then he began to speak, not to ask questions, but to give instructions. "You will not remember the ride here. You will not think of your brother without first hearing my voice. You will not dream unless I allow it." Hours passed. Timothy's pulse slowed. His eyelids trembled. But he never spoke. Hartwell watched every reaction, noting the smallest changes in the flicker of his gaze. When the session ended, Timothy did not ask what had been done. He simply followed Hartwell to a narrow cell in the sub-level of the building, a bed, a basin, a single oil lamp. The door closed with a sound that did not belong in a place of learning. Above them, the city went about its night unaware that one of the Henderson twins was no longer a free man, not in body, not in mind. And miles away on the plantation, Thomas woke suddenly in the dark, certain that something was missing, but he could not name what. In Richmond, Timothy's world narrowed to a pattern: wake to the scrape of the cell door, follow Hartwell or one of his assistants to the chamber, sit in the chair, straps across wrists, ankles, chest, forehead. The brass arm lowered until it hovered just above his skin. Then came the light, not blinding, but insistent, pressing into his eyes until the rest of the room dissolved. Hartwell's voice filled the space between the pulses of light, not questions now, commands. "When you hear my step, you will stand. When I touch your shoulder, you will close your eyes. When you see your brother, you will feel nothing." The sessions blurred into one another until Timothy could no longer say how long he had been inside the college. Sometimes he thought of the plantation, but the image would fade before he could fix it in his mind. Other times he saw Thomas clearly, but always at a distance, as though looking through glass. Hartwell kept meticulous notes: pulse rate, pupil size, the length of time. Timothy could hold a single breath without strain. When an assistant suggested the process might be harming him, Hartwell smiled. Harm is a matter of perspective. On the plantation, Thomas's decline was less orderly. At first, he tried to resume the routines they had shared, overseeing the workers, walking the fields at dawn, but without Timothy beside him, the days stretched too wide. He began sleeping in odd places: the stables, the smokehouse, the edge of the riverbank. Servants reported hearing him talking to someone when no one else was present. By August, he no longer trusted the mirrors in the house. He claimed they did not always return his reflection. One night, Jeremiah found him standing in front of the tall mirror in the dining room, holding a candlestick like a weapon. When asked what he was doing, Thomas said, "He's in there, but it's not me." Word spread to Richmond, and Hartwell heard it before. The week was out, he wrote in his journal. Subject: a deteriorating without stimulus. Recommend retrieval for comparative study. They came for Thomas before dawn. 2 men Jeremiah trusted with shipments. Strong, silent, paid in gold. He did not tell Thomas where he was going, only that Richmond needed him. Thomas didn't resist. He climbed into the wagon as though he had been waiting for it all along. The road was long and wet from a night's rain. At times Thomas spoke quietly to himself, lips moving without sound. Once, when the driver glanced back, he saw Thomas smile at something in the empty seat beside him. When they reached the medical college, Hartwell was already at the gate. His expression gave nothing away. He guided Thomas through the courtyard and into the east wing. The smell of chemicals and oil lamps wrapped around them as the door shut behind. Thomas's first sight of Timothy in months was not the reunion either man would have chosen. Timothy stood inside the chamber room, his posture straight, his hands at his sides, his eyes fixed on some point just past Thomas's shoulder. No recognition, no movement, just stillness. Thomas's voice cracked on his brother's name. Timothy didn't answer. Hartwell stepped between them. "You'll see him when the work allows it." That day, Thomas was given his own cell in the sub-level. No windows, a bed bolted to the floor, a lamp whose flame Hartwell controlled from the hallway. From then on, the twins existed under the same roof, yet in separate worlds. Hartwell moved between them like a conductor. One session of stimulation for Thomas. Heat, noise, provocation. One session of stillness for Timothy. Cold, silence, deprivation. He recorded the differences with the precision of a man charting the orbit of planets. By winter, Richmond knew only rumors that the Henderson boys had gone mad, that Hartwell was keeping them as specimens, that the college itself had rooms you could enter but never leave. Hartwell kept his own version of the truth locked away in a drawer, 2 sets of no-cur. Tes marked A and B, and a third book with no labels at all, just a single line on the first page. When they meet again, the result will be decisive. The meeting came in February. Snow clung to the college's roof, muting the city's noise. Hartwell chose the hour with care, late enough that the staff had gone, early enough that the streets outside were still asleep. The chamber had been cleared. No straps, no brass device, only 2 chairs facing each other in the center of the room, one for subject A, one for subject B. They brought Thomas in first. He looked thinner than when he'd arrived, but his eyes still burned with restless energy. He scanned the room, searching for a way out that wasn't there. Then Timothy entered. His steps were measured, his gaze unfocused, until Hartwell touched his shoulder. At that signal, his eyes locked on Thomas and did not move away. For a long minute, neither spoke. Hartwell circled them like a man inspecting animals before a fight. He told Thomas to speak. Thomas asked his brother if he knew him. Timothy's answer was slow, deliberate. "I know what you were." Hartwell noted the change in Thomas's posture, the tightening of his hands, the sharp breath through his nose. He told Timothy to stand. Timothy rose without breaking eye contact. Then Hartwell stepped back and gave no further instructions. At first they only stared. Thomas spoke in fragments, memories from their childhood, names of people they'd known, places they had gone together. Timothy did not respond to any of them. When Thomas reached for his arm, Timothy moved with sudden precision, twisting his brother's wrist and forcing him to his knees, no anger in his face, only the calm of someone completing a task they had been taught many times before. Hartwell wrote in his notes, Subject B dominant under minimal provocation. Subject A incapable of countermeasure without verbal engagement. Thomas looked up at his brother, breathing hard. What did he do to you? Timothy released him and stepped back, waiting for Hartwell's next command. It never came. Instead, Hartwell closed his notebook and said, almost to himself, Now we begin the real work. From that day forward, Hartwell stopped treating Thomas and Timothy as separate cases. They became two halves of the same instrument. Mornings began in the East Wing's largest room, a space cleared of furniture except for a long chalk line drawn across the floor. Hartwell would place Timothy on one side, Thomas on the other. The sessions had no fixed length. Sometimes he spoke to them both, sometimes to only one, sometimes to neither. The point was always the same. Provoke, restrain, observe. He would feed Thomas first, letting the smell of bread and broth reach Timothy before the tray was taken away. He would let Timothy rest, then force Thomas into hours of labor in the yard, before returning him to stand beside his brother. He told them lies in opposite directions, that one had been trying to leave, that the other had been asking for their release. Then he watched what those lies did to their faces. The chalk line was not to be crossed without instruction, but Thomas tested it often. A step forward, a lean across. Each time, Timothy responded instantly. A block, a shove, a grip around the forearm that felt mechanical in its steadiness. Hartwell began adding objects between them. A chair, a crate, once a mirror. The mirror was the only time Thomas truly faltered. He stood looking not at his own reflection, but at Timothy's behind the glass. Timothy looked back, unblinking, as if waiting for a signal Thomas couldn't hear. By March, the twins had stopped speaking to each other entirely. Their communication became glances, shifts in weight, a tightening of the jaw. Hartwell read these like another man might read print on a page. He wrote, The connection remains, but I hold the thread. In the cellar beneath the college, Hartwell kept a separate space, one no assistant was allowed to enter. It was here, under the light of a single hanging bulb, that he began the final phase. Both brothers. It was in the same room, both restrained but close enough to touch if they strained, a single object placed on the table between them, sometimes a key, sometimes a knife. The instructions were always simple, only one of you will leave this room. The first night Hartwell made the choice real. The air in the cellar felt different, closer, heavier. The bulb swung faintly on its cord, sending shadows sliding across the walls. Thomas was brought in first, wrists bound, a scrape along his jaw from the struggle in the hallway. Timothy followed, walking without resistance, his bindings neat and even. They were seated across from each other at the metal table. Hartwell placed the object between them. A small hunting knife, clean and sharp. Its handle caught the light every time the bulb swayed. He spoke slowly. Only one of you will leave this room. No more trials, no more chalk lines. One leaves, one stays. Thomas's eyes darted to Timothy's face, searching for some flicker of the brother he'd known. Timothy's gaze stayed fixed on the knife, as if waiting for Hartwell to give the word. When no word came, Timothy looked up, and for the first time in months, his voice was his own. Do you want to live? Thomas tried to answer, but Hartwell cut in, no talking unless it's part of the choice. Minutes passed. Neither moved. The bulb's swing slowed, and the cellar settled into a silence broken only by breathing. Then Thomas leaned forward, testing the distance. Timothy reacted instantly, pulling the knife toward himself, the blade glinting just inches from his chest. Hartwell made a note without looking up. reflexes intact under high-stakes stress. Thomas froze, then slowly sat back. The moment stretched until it felt like a weight pressing down on all three men. Finally, Hartwell stepped forward, took the knife from Timothy's hand and set it aside. "That's enough for tonight." As they were led away, Thomas turned his head toward his brother. Timothy did not return the look. But when the cellar door closed, Hartwell thought, though he could not be certain, that Timothy's left hand flexed twice in quick succession, as if sending a signal no one else was meant to understand. The next time, Hartwell did not stay to watch. He brought them into the cellar as before, the table, the chairs, the single hanging bulb. But this time no knife, no key, only a bucket of water, a crust of bread, and a bolt on the outside of the door. He told them nothing except, "When I return, I'll see who's ready to leave." Then he shut the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home echoed in the space long after his footsteps faded. Hours passed in silence. Thomas sat with his back to the wall, arms around his knees. Timothy stood for a long time, then paced the edges of the room like an animal measuring its cage. They did not speak. Every time Thomas's eyes met his brother's, Timothy looked away, but never for long. At some point, the bread was gone. Neither could say who had eaten it. When the bulb began to hum, Thomas broke first. "What is he doing to you?" Timothy didn't answer. Instead, he crouched in front of his brother, studying his face as though searching for an answer of his own. The hours bled together. Sleep came in brief, ragged bursts, interrupted by the creak of footsteps above or the shift of the building's weight in the cold. By the second day, the water bucket was nearly empty. Thomas's voice was hoarse. "He's not coming back, is he?" This time Timothy spoke. "He will, when he knows what we are." Thomas didn't ask what that meant. He was too tired, and there was something in Timothy's tone, steady, practiced, that made the question feel dangerous. On the third day, the bolt slid back. Hartwell stepped inside, his eyes moving between them. Neither man stood. He smiled, satisfied, and said, "Next time you'll be ready." The final session began without warning. Before dawn, the twins were taken from their cells, led down separate staircases, and brought into the cellar from opposite doors. The table was gone. The bucket was gone. The only thing in the room was a single length of chain bolted to the floor, just long enough for them to reach each other, and nothing else. Hartwell stood in the doorway, coat still on, gloves buttoned tight. He didn't step inside. "This is the last time," he said. "When I open this door again, one of you will walk out. The other will remain." The bolt slid shut. The sound of his footsteps faded until there was only the low electric hum of the bulb above. For a long while, they didn't move. Thomas's breathing was quick and uneven. Timothy's was slow, deliberate. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice shook. "He's made you into something you're not." Timothy's reply came quiet but firm. "He's shown me what I am." They circled each other in the small radius the chain allowed. Every motion was measured, every shift of weight calculated. The first lunge was Thomas's, a sudden grab at Timothy's collar, driving him back toward the wall. Timothy didn't resist at first. Then, with frightening precision, he twisted, using the chain to pull Thomas off balance. They fell together, hitting the floor hard. For a moment, neither moved. Then Timothy's hand pressed against his brother's throat, not tight enough to crush, but firm enough to warn. Thomas stared up at him, eyes wide. "You don't have to do this." Something flickered across Timothy's face. Not recognition, but hesitation. His hand loosened just enough for Thomas to draw a ragged breath. The bulb above swayed, shadows lurching across the walls.
Timothy's lips parted as if to speak, but the sound of the bolt sliding back froze them both. Hartwell stepped inside, eyes scanning the scene like a man rehearse,
eating the end of a familiar book. He looked at Thomas, then at Timothy and said, "I see. We're finished here."
Hartwell didn't give the order to separate them. He simply stood there, the door open behind him, letting the cold from the upper hall spill into the cellar. Timothy stayed kneeling over his brother, hands still resting at Thomas's throat, not tightening, not releasing. Thomas's breath came in shallow bursts, his eyes locked on Hartwell as if the man himself held the chain. Finally, Hartwell spoke. "One of you leaves tonight. That hasn't changed." Timothy looked down at Thomas, and something in his gaze softened, so slightly that Hartwell might have missed it if he weren't watching for exactly that. Then Timothy rose, pulling Thomas to his feet by the chain. They stood side by side. Thomas swayed, but did not step away. Hartwell's gloved hand pointed to the doorway. Timothy moved first, leading his brother with him. The chain scraped along the floor as they crossed the threshold. In the corridor beyond, an assistant waited with 2 sets of papers and only 1 coat. Hartwell took the coat, holding it between his hands as though weighing it. Then he placed it over Thomas's shoulders. "You'll go. He stays." Thomas's mouth opened, but Timothy's hand on his arm kept him silent. Their eyes met for the last time. Thomas's wide with disbelief, Timothy's unreadable. The assistant led Thomas away. Hartwell watched until the sound of their steps disappeared up the stairwell. When the cellar door shut again, Timothy was still standing in the same spot. Hartwell approached, his voice low. "You made the right choice." Timothy didn't answer. But in the swing of the single bulb, Hartwell thought he saw his mouth form 2 words, too soft to hear, before the light steadied and the moment was gone. Thomas left the college grounds just after midnight. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet stone and wood smoke from somewhere far beyond the gates. The coat Hartwell had given him hung heavy on his shoulders, its lining smelling faintly of dust and chemical preservative. No one spoke to him as he walked. The road beyond the gates was empty, and the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel under his boots. He didn't know how far he'd gone before he stopped. In the silence, he could still feel the faint pull of the chain in his hands, the warmth of Timothy's grip as he'd been led toward the door. Thomas looked back once. The college was a black silhouette against the cloudy sky, its windows dark except for one, low and small, the one that looked out from the cellar. A figure stood there for only a moment before the light went out. In the weeks that followed, Thomas did not speak of Hartwell, or the chalk lines, or the knife. He told no one about the cellar, but sometimes, in the half-light before dawn, he would wake with the feeling that someone was still watching him, measuring his steps, his silences, his choices. And in those moments, he could almost hear it again. 2 quick, silent flexes of a hand, as if sending a message through the dark. Thomas tried to measure his freedom in distance. 2 miles from the college, he was still glancing over his shoulder. 5 miles, and he could no longer hear the echo of his own footsteps bouncing off its walls, but the silence felt wrong, as if something were missing. He reached a small town by dawn. The innkeeper didn't ask for his name, only payment. The coins Hartwell had pressed into his hand before the gate were cold when Thomas gave them over, as though they had been kept somewhere deep underground. That night, he lay in a narrow bed beneath a sagging roof, unable to sleep. Every creak in the boards sounded like the shift of a chair on concrete. Every flicker of the candle on the table made him expect the swing of a lone bulb. When he did drift into sleep, he dreamed of the chain between them, not as it had been in the cellar, but stretched impossibly long, one end in his hand, the other vanishing into darkness. Something was pulling on it, slow and steady. He woke to find his fingers curled as if still holding the links. The candle had burned low, and for an instant before his eyes adjusted,
he thought he saw someone sitting in the corner. When the shape resolved into nothing but shadow, the relief was brief, because the chain in his dream had been pulling harder. By the third week, Thomas stopped telling himself it was just nerves. The first sign came in the marketplace. A man in a grey coat standing by the clock tower, reading a folded newspaper. Nothing unusual, except the man never turned a page, and when Thomas walked past, he caught the faintest nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken. The second sign was the letter. It arrived at the inn with no address, only his room number written in sharp, deliberate script. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words, no signature. Just 2 short lines, drawn side by side in black ink. The third sign came at night. A knock on the door, soft enough that it might have been the wind. When Thomas opened it, the hallway was empty, but on the floor lay a single metal link, the same weight, the same shape as the chain from the cellar. He held it in his palm until the metal's chill burned into his skin. Somewhere deep down, he knew it wasn't a threat. It was an answer. The cellar felt larger without Thomas, though Timothy knew it was only the absence of the chain's pull. Hartwell didn't speak to him for days. Assistants brought food, removed it untouched, and replaced the bulb when it began to flicker. The silence was meant to press down, to shape him. When Hartwell finally returned, he didn't come alone. Behind him stood a boy, younger than Timothy, eyes darting around the cellar with the skittishness of something newly caught. The boy's wrists were bound, his steps guided by Hartwell's gloved hand. Timothy understood without being told. He was not a subject now. He was a measure. Hartwell set the boy down on the stool that had once been his, then looked to Timothy. "You know what comes next?" Timothy glanced at the chain coiled in the corner. It gleamed faintly in the bulb's light, each link familiar in weight and sound. As Hartwell turned to leave, the boy looked up at Timothy, lips trembling. Timothy crouched, meeting his gaze. "Don't fight it," he said quietly. His tone was not cruel, but it carried the weight of someone who had learned there was no escape, only survival in the spaces Hartwell allowed. And yet, as he rose, Timothy slipped something into the boy's palm. A tiny scrap of folded paper no bigger than a thumbnail. Hartwell didn't notice. The scrap of paper reached Thomas on a rain-swept morning. It came folded into the hollow of a loaf of bread, delivered by a boy who never met his eyes. The paper was damp at the edges, but the fold was still sharp, deliberate. Timothy's hand, Thomas knew instantly. He locked the door before opening it. Inside were no words, only the same 2 short lines as before, and beneath them, a third, jagged mark, slashing downward. The moment he saw it, he felt the pull, the chain from his dreams, yanked hard enough to make his breath catch. His vision blurred, the rain outside becoming the steady drip of water in the cellar. He could smell the damp concrete, hear the swing of the bulb. Then a knock, 3 sharp raps. He turned toward the door, heart hammering, and saw the man in the grey coat standing there. This time, the man's hand rested on the handle. "You're coming back," he said. Not a question. Thomas's mouth was dry. In his palm, the paper felt heavier than iron. Somewhere in the darkness behind the man's eyes, he thought he saw Timothy, waiting, watching, measuring his choice.